Margaret Turner's wrinkled hands gripped the smooth leather of the car seat, her pulse racing in a way she hadn't felt in years. The streets of Memphis blurred past, their familiar rhythm suddenly feeling like a farewell song. She couldn't shake the knot forming in her chest, a dull ache that came with suspicion. Her son, Luke, her sweet, devoted Luke, sat at the wheel, his jaw clenched just enough to make her nervous. His eyes, the same pale blue that had charmed her when she first found him abandoned on the church steps, stayed fixed on the road ahead. "Where are you taking me?" she asked, her voice firmer this time. "Where are you watching from? Have you ever witnessed such a scene? If it were you, what would you do? Please publicly comment your thoughts in the comment line below. If you find it interesting, please like and subscribe to the channel to see more tomorrow." Luke smiled, his dimples flashing like they always did when he tried to soothe her worries. "It's a surprise, Mom. Trust me." Trust him? She had trusted him for 40 years, through scraped knees, teenage rebellion, and college tears. But lately, trust felt like a fragile thread, especially after overhearing his hushed conversations about care facilities and what's best for her. The words stung like a betrayal. "I'm not going to one of those homes, Luke," Margaret said, narrowing her eyes. "If that's what this is, you'd better turn this car around right now." Luke sighed, a low sound that seemed to carry the weight of the world. "It's not what you think," he said, but the tightening of his grip on the steering wheel betrayed him. Margaret crossed her arms, her resolve hardening. She had spent a lifetime standing tall against challenges, raising 4 children on her own, fighting for respect as a black woman in a city that hadn't always welcomed her. She wasn't about to let her son make decisions about her life without her say-so. "Then what is it?" she demanded. "Because I've been hearing things, Luke, about plans I wasn't part of." He hesitated, his eyes flicking toward her briefly before returning to the road. "You'll understand when we get there," he said softly. Margaret leaned back, her lips pressed into a thin line. The trees lining the street seemed to mock her with their calm sway in the autumn breeze. This was her life, her independence, and she wasn't ready to give it up. The car ride stretched on, silent except for the soft hum of the engine. Margaret stared out the window, watching the scenery shift from the familiar bustle of downtown Memphis to quieter, tree-lined roads. The neighborhoods grew larger, the houses more spaced apart, as if the city itself were trying to push her into solitude. "You can't avoid the conversation forever, Luke," she said, breaking the silence. Her voice was sharper than she intended, but the knot in her stomach wouldn't let her be gentle. Luke glanced at her but said nothing, his lips a firm, unreadable line. Margaret sighed, shaking her head. "I thought we were past this," she muttered. "I raised you better than to keep secrets from me." His knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. "It's not a secret, Mom," he said finally, his tone clipped. I want it to be a surprise." "A surprise?" Margaret repeated, her eyebrows shooting up. "Luke, surprises are for birthdays. This feels like something else entirely." He didn't answer, and his silence was infuriating. Margaret shifted in her seat, her mind racing with possibilities. She couldn't shake the memory of that phone call she'd overheard last week. Luke's voice hushed, urgent, as he spoke to someone about making arrangements and what's best for her. It felt like betrayal, plain and simple. After all these years, after everything they'd been through together, how could he even think of putting her in one of those homes? "I'm still capable, you know," she said, her voice quieter now. "I can cook, clean, take care of myself. I don't need strangers to do it for me." Luke's grip on the wheel softened, and he sighed deeply. "It's not about what you can do, Mom," he said. "It's about what you deserve." The words caught her off guard. She frowned, trying to decipher the meaning behind them. "And what exactly do you think I deserve?" Luke hesitated again, his eyes fixed on the road as if searching for the right answer in the stretch of asphalt ahead. "You'll see," he said finally. Margaret shook her head, exasperated. Her son had always been a bit of a mystery, quiet and introspective, the kind of child who would spend hours building intricate Lego creations while the world rushed on around him. But this was something else entirely. The car slowed as they turned onto a narrow, winding road lined with tall oak trees. The canopy above filtered the sunlight into a soft, golden glow, and for a moment, Margaret forgot her frustration. The place was beautiful, almost serene. "Where are we?" she asked, her tone softening despite herself. Luke turned off the engine and finally met her gaze. His expression was a mixture of nervousness and pride. "It's yours," he said simply. Margaret stared at him, the words not quite registering. "Mine?" He nodded. "You said you didn't want to go to a nursing home. So, I bought you a house." Her heart stopped. For a moment, she couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All she could do was stare at the house and wonder if this was some kind of elaborate joke. "Luke," her voice cracked. "What did you do?" Margaret's breath caught in her throat as Luke handed her a single brass key, warm from his pocket. The weight of it in her palm felt surreal, like holding onto a piece of someone else's life. "This is crazy," she said, her voice trembling. "Look, you didn't have to do this. Where did you even get the money for a place like this?" Luke's face softened into a small, sheepish smile. "I've been saving for years," he admitted. "I always knew I wanted to give you something meaningful, something you deserved." Her fingers tightened around the key as a wave of emotions surged through her. Gratitude, confusion, disbelief. "But this a house, Luke? This is too much." He shook his head. "It's not too much, Mom. Not after everything you've done for me. Raising me, believing in me when no one else did." His voice trailed off, and for a moment, his expression was distant, as though he were reliving memories he didn't often share. Margaret looked back at the house, her heart racing. The place was stunning, but it didn't feel real. It didn't feel hers. "Come on," Luke said, nudging her gently. "You haven't even seen the inside yet." He led her up the porch steps, the wood creaking slightly under their weight. Margaret noticed the little details as they approached the door. The freshly painted railings, the carefully chosen doormat that read "Welcome Home." When Luke pushed open the door, Margaret's jaw dropped. The interior was just as breathtaking as the outside. The living room was spacious, with polished hardwood floors and a brick fireplace that gave the room a cozy charm. Sunlight streamed through large windows, highlighting the soft, cream-colored furniture and vibrant artwork on the walls. But it was the little touches that made Margaret's throat tighten. A quilt she'd made decades ago was draped over the back of the couch. Framed photographs of her and Luke adorned the mantel, some from his childhood, others from more recent years. "How did you?" she began, her voice breaking. "I had some help," Luke admitted, scratching the back of his neck. "Aunt Rose lent a hand with decorating, and I might have sneaked into your place a few times to grab some of your things." Margaret turned to him, her eyes wide. "You went through my things?" He raised his hands defensively. "Just the sentimental stuff. I wanted this place to feel like home for you from the start." She looked around again, taking it all in. There was a familiar vase on the dining table, filled with fresh lilies, her favorite flower. The kitchen, visible through an open archway, was equipped with all the gadgets she loved but could never afford. "I don't know what to say," Margaret whispered, tears brimming in her eyes. "You don't have to say anything," Luke said, his voice soft. "Just tell me you like it." Margaret reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. "I love it," she said, her voice firm despite the tears rolling down her cheeks. "But Luke, why? Why now?" He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. "Because you've spent your whole life putting other people first," he said. "And I couldn't stand the thought of you spending your golden years in some place that didn't feel like you." Margaret stared at him, her heart swelling with pride and love. "You're a good man, Luke," she said, her voice trembling. "A better man than I ever could have dreamed of raising." He smiled, his eyes glistening. "That's because I had the best teacher." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the moment settling between them. Then Luke broke the stillness with a grin. "Come on," he said, leading her toward the kitchen. "You haven't even seen the best part." "The best part?" Margaret asked, her brow furrowing. Luke pushed open a door off the kitchen, revealing a bright, airy room filled with art supplies, canvases, paints, brushes, and even a brand new easel. Margaret gasped. "Luke, this? You've always said you wanted to paint more," he said, his grin widening. Now you've got the space and the tools. No excuses. Margaret touched the edge of the easel, her hands trembling. She hadn't painted in years, not since her husband's passing. Life had gotten in the way. Work, bills, raising Luke. Do you like it? He asked, his voice uncertain now. She turned to him, tears streaming down her face. I don't just like it, Luke. I love it. I love you. Luke pulled her into a hug, holding her tightly. You deserve this, Mom. All of it. For the first time in years, Margaret felt truly at peace. And for the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine a future filled with possibility. Luke sat on the back porch, the faint hum of cicadas filling the air as the sun dipped below the horizon. Margaret had fallen silent after their emotional afternoon, lost in her thoughts as she unpacked her few belongings. Watching her, Luke felt a quiet satisfaction, but it was tinged with exhaustion, one he hadn't shared with her yet. The truth was, getting this house hadn't been easy. Margaret stepped outside, her soft footsteps barely audible on the wooden planks. You've been quiet, she said, sitting beside him. Luke hesitated, his gaze fixed on the sprawling yard ahead. Just thinking. About? She pressed gently. He glanced at her, the corners of his mouth twitching upward. About how much you're going to love gardening back here. Margaret raised an eyebrow, not fooled by the deflection. Luke, she said, her tone firm. What's going on? For a moment, he debated brushing it off, but her steady gaze reminded him of all the times she'd seen right through him as a kid, all the times she'd demanded honesty and given him the same in return. It wasn't easy, Mom, he admitted, exhaling deeply. Getting this place, making it happen. Margaret's brow furrowed. What do you mean? You said you'd been saving. I did save, he interrupted, his voice firm but not unkind. But I had to sell some things too. The car, for one. And I worked a second job for the past year. Margaret's eyes widened. The car? Luke, that was your dream car. You've been restoring it for years. He shrugged, though the memory of parting with it still stung. It's just a car, Mom. You're more important than any piece of metal. Tears welled in her eyes. Luke, I never wanted you to do something like that for me. You didn't ask me to, he said gently, cutting her off. I wanted to. You've given me everything, Mom. This was the least I could do. Margaret shook her head, her hands trembling. But what about you? Your dreams, your life? I don't want you giving all of that up just to take care of me. He reached for her hand, holding it firmly. My dreams are nothing without you in them, he said. And besides, I'm not giving anything up. I'm investing in something I believe in, you. Margaret was silent for a long moment, her thoughts a whirlwind. She remembered the countless nights she'd spent worrying about Luke's future, wondering if she'd done enough as a mother. And now, here he was, a man willing to sacrifice his own comforts for her sake. You've always been stubborn, she said finally, a wry smile tugging at her lips. Luke chuckled. Wonder where I got that from. She swatted his arm lightly, the motion filled with affection. I don't deserve you, you know. Wrong, he replied without hesitation. You deserve the world, Mom. Margaret leaned back, her gaze drifting to the stars beginning to appear in the sky. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, Luke was right. Inside the house, Margaret wandered into her art room later that night. The sight of the easel and paints still made her heart ache with gratitude. She touched the edge of the canvas, her fingers tracing the smooth surface as memories of her younger self flooded back. How she used to dream of being an artist, how she'd given it all up to raise Luke. Now, she realized, she had a chance to start again. The next morning, Margaret found Luke in the kitchen, a steaming cup of coffee in his hand. He looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes betraying the toll of the past year. You need rest, she said, her voice filled with concern. He smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. I'll rest when you're settled. Margaret shook her head. You've done enough, Luke. It's time for you to take care of yourself, too. He hesitated, then nodded. Deal, he said. But only if you promise me one thing. What's that? Paint something, he said, his tone light but his eyes earnest. For you. Not for me. Not for anyone else, just for you. Margaret's heart swelled. Okay, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. And as Luke left for work that day, Margaret sat in front of her easel for the first time in decades. With every stroke of the brush, she felt a little piece of herself returning, a piece she hadn't even realized she'd lost. Margaret stared at the blank canvas, her hands trembling slightly as she held the brush. It had been decades since she'd painted anything, and doubt whispered in her ear. What if you've forgotten how? What if it's too late? The scent of fresh paint filled the room, stirring memories of long afternoons spent creating, before life had taken over, before sacrifices had reshaped her dreams. She took a deep breath, dipped the brush into the rich, vibrant blue paint, and made the first stroke. It was uneven, hesitant, but it was a beginning. Hours passed as Margaret lost herself in the swirls of color. Her hands grew steadier with each movement, the rhythm of painting both soothing and exhilarating. She didn't realize Luke had returned home until she heard the soft knock at the door. "Mom, can I come in?" Margaret quickly set the brush down, self-conscious about what she created. "Of course," she called, wiping her hands on a rag. Luke stepped inside, his eyes immediately drawn to the canvas. It was a simple painting, a field of wildflowers under a radiant sky, but something about it felt alive, as though it held a piece of Margaret's soul. "Wow," he said softly. "Mom, this is incredible." She laughed nervously. "It's not much, just something to practice with." He shook his head, his expression serious. "Don't sell yourself short. You've got a gift." Margaret felt her cheeks flush. "It's been so long. I wasn't sure if I still had it in me." "Well, you do," Luke said firmly. "And I think it's time the world saw it too." The idea caught her off guard. "What do you mean?" she asked, narrowing her eyes at him. Luke grinned, a mischievous glint in his eyes. "I mean, we should find a way to showcase your work. An art fair, maybe? Or even just a gallery showing. People need to see what you can do." Margaret's heart raced at the thought. "Look, I'm not ready for something like that. This is just for me. For now. And that's okay," he said. "But when you are ready, promise me you'll think about it." She smiled, unable to say no to the determination in his voice. "I'll think about it," she said, though part of her wondered if she ever truly would. The next few weeks flew by in a blur of color and creativity. Margaret threw herself into her art, painting every day. She experimented with styles, rediscovered old techniques, and even began incorporating elements of her own story into her work. Luke watched with quiet pride as the house filled with vibrant canvases. Margaret seemed lighter, more alive, than he'd seen her in years. It was as if painting had unlocked something inside her, a part of herself she'd long forgotten. But as Margaret's confidence grew, so did Luke's worries. He'd done everything he could to make this transition smooth for her, but the financial strain was starting to take its toll. The second job was grueling, and he barely had time to sleep, let alone take care of himself. One evening, Margaret noticed the fatigue etched into his face. "Look," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "you're working too hard. You need to slow down." "I'm fine, Mom," he replied, brushing off her concern. "No, you're not," she insisted. "I can see it. You're burning the candle at both ends, and it's not sustainable." Luke sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I just want to make sure everything's okay for you." Margaret placed a hand on his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Everything is okay, because of you. But I don't need you to do this alone. Let me help." "How?" he asked, genuinely curious. She smiled, a spark of determination in her eyes. "By selling my art. I've been thinking about what you said, and maybe it's time to take that leap." Luke was taken aback. "Are you sure?" "I am," she said firmly. "You've sacrificed so much for me, Luke. Let me do something for us." Over the next few days, they worked together to photograph Margaret's paintings and set up an online shop. Margaret was nervous at first, but Luke's encouragement kept her going. When the first painting sold, she was stunned. By the end of the week, several more had found new homes, and the influx of support from buyers and admirers alike left her overwhelmed with gratitude. One evening, as they celebrated her success with takeout pizza in the living room, Margaret turned to Luke with a thoughtful expression. You know, she said, this isn't just about the art. It's about finding myself again. And I couldn't have done it without you. Luke smiled, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten. You've always had it in you, Mom. You just needed a little nudge. Margaret reached for his hand, her eyes shining. I don't know what I did to deserve a son like you, but I'm grateful every day. Luke squeezed her hand, his voice soft but steady. You deserve everything, Mom, and we're just getting started. The orders started coming in faster than Margaret could have imagined. At first, it was 1 or 2 paintings a week, manageable, even exciting. But soon, her email inbox was flooded with inquiries from people all over the country, asking for custom pieces or offering to pay double for something already sold. Margaret stared at the screen in disbelief one morning. Look, she called out, her voice tinged with panic. He came running into the room, still holding a mug of coffee. What's wrong? She pointed to the laptop. Look at this. How am I supposed to handle all of this? I'm just one person. Luke leaned over her shoulder, scrolling through the messages. This is incredible, Mom. It means people really love your work. I know, but I wasn't expecting this. I don't even have enough supplies to meet the demand. Luke smiled, trying to ease her nerves. Then we'll figure it out, one step at a time. But figuring it out wasn't as simple as it sounded. Margaret quickly found herself overwhelmed by the sheer volume of work. Her once peaceful days of painting had turned into a frantic race against deadlines, and the joy she'd rediscovered began to feel like a burden. One night, as she sat at the dining table surrounded by half-finished canvases, Luke walked in and frowned. You haven't stopped all day, have you? Margaret sighed, not looking up. I'm trying to keep up. People are expecting these pieces, and I don't want to let them down. Luke gently took the brush from her hand. Mom, you can't pour from an empty cup. You need to take a break. But, no buts, he said firmly. Your health is more important than any deadline. Reluctantly, Margaret agreed to slow down. They devised a plan to manage the orders more effectively, setting realistic timelines and learning to say no when the workload became too much. Luke even suggested raising her prices, a move that felt uncomfortable at first but ultimately helped reduce the demand to a more manageable level. As things began to stabilize, Margaret started to enjoy painting again. She found a rhythm that allowed her to balance her passion with her well-being, and Luke's unwavering support made all the difference. But while Margaret's days grew brighter, Luke's were growing darker. One evening, Margaret noticed Luke sitting on the couch, his head in his hands. Luke, what's going on? She asked, sitting down beside him. He hesitated, then sighed heavily. It's nothing, Mom. Just work stuff. Don't lie to me, she said gently. I can see it in your eyes. You're exhausted. Luke nodded, his shoulders slumping. The second job is wearing me out, and I feel like I'm barely keeping up. But I don't want to quit because I want to make sure you're okay. Margaret's heart ached at the sight of him. Luke, you've done so much for me already. You can't keep sacrificing your own well-being. Let me help. You are helping, he said. But it's not just about money. It's about being there for you. And I appreciate that more than you'll ever know, she said, her voice thick with emotion. But I need you to take care of yourself too. Promise me you'll think about cutting back. Luke nodded reluctantly. I'll think about it. The next day, Margaret decided to do something to lighten Luke's load. She reached out to a local community center that hosted art workshops, offering to teach a class. The director was thrilled by the idea, and within a week, Margaret was leading a group of eager students in their first session. Teaching reignited a different kind of passion in Margaret. She loved sharing her knowledge and watching her students discover the joy of creating. It also provided a steady income that allowed her to contribute more to the household. When she told Luke about the workshops, his eyes lit up. Mom, that's amazing. I'm so proud of you. It's a start, she said with a smile. And it's my way of giving back, not just to the community, but to you. You've carried us for so long, Luke. Now it's my turn. Margaret stood at the front of the community center, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the canvas for the evening's class. It had been a week since she'd started teaching, and the experience had changed her more than she could have imagined. The students, mostly young adults, Some teenagers, others her age, came with different stories, but they all shared one thing in common. They were eager to learn. As she began to explain the day's lesson, Margaret felt a surge of pride. These were the moments she had longed for when she was younger. Moments of connection, of giving something back, of being part of something bigger than herself. Let the paint speak to you, she encouraged them. You don't need to be perfect, you just need to express yourself. That's what art is all about. Her voice carried, steady and full of conviction. She wasn't just teaching them how to paint. She was teaching them how to believe in their own abilities, to trust that they had something valuable to offer. The room was filled with the sound of brushes on canvas, the quiet hum of creation. Meanwhile, at home, Luke was taking the first steps toward reshaping his own life. He had cut back on his hours at the second job, but the pressure of juggling responsibilities still weighed heavily on him. That morning, he'd gone for a run, something he hadn't done in months. The fresh air had helped clear his head, but the truth was, he didn't know what direction to take next. For so long, his focus had been on helping Margaret and getting by. But now that she was flourishing, he realized he had the chance to think about his own future. The question was, what did he want? Luke found himself at the kitchen table one afternoon, scrolling through job listings on his phone, trying to find something that sparked his interest. He had a background in construction, but the thought of going back into it felt stifling. He wanted more than the routine, more than the grind. His gaze drifted to the framed photograph of him and Margaret from last summer, their arms around each other at a family barbecue. He smiled at the memory, but the weight of uncertainty still clung to him. That night, as they sat down for dinner, Margaret noticed his distracted air. "What's going on, Luke? You've been quieter than usual." He hesitated, putting down his fork. "I'm just thinking, trying to figure out what's next." "You've been doing that for a while," she said gently. "What do you really want?" Luke met her gaze. "I don't know, Mom. I want to help, like I always have, but I'm starting to feel like I'm losing myself in the process." Margaret's heart ached. She had always been there for him, but in this moment, she realized that her son needed something more than just her support. He needed the space to discover his own path. "You don't have to carry everything for both of us, Luke," she said softly. "I'm doing better now, and I want you to take the time to figure out what makes you happy. Whatever that is, I'll support you just like you've supported me." Luke stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. For the first time in a long while, he felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe it was time to stop waiting for the right moment and start creating one. The next morning, Luke made a decision. He reached out to an old friend, someone who had started his own small business in landscaping. Luke had always enjoyed working with his hands, and the thought of turning his passion into a career seemed like the perfect fit. To his surprise, his friend offered him a job on the spot. The pay was good, and the work was rewarding, but most importantly, it was flexible. Luke would have the time to pursue other interests, maybe even go back to school, as he'd always wanted. Margaret could see the change in Luke as the days went by. He was more energized, more at peace. They spent their evenings talking about their plans, their dreams, and the future they wanted to build together. Margaret knew that Luke wasn't just her rock. He was also finding his own strength, his own direction, and she couldn't have been prouder. As for her art, the workshops continued to thrive. More people signed up each week, and Margaret's name was slowly becoming well known in the community. She even started selling some of her pieces to local businesses, which gave her a sense of validation she hadn't expected. One afternoon, a local gallery contacted her with an invitation to exhibit her work. She was stunned. The idea of having her art on display in a formal setting felt surreal, but she knew it was the next step in her journey. "I can't believe this is happening," Margaret said as she sat down with Luke that evening. "You deserve it, Mom," he replied, smiling. "You've worked so hard for this. It's your time to shine." The next few weeks flew by as Margaret prepared for the gallery exhibit. Luke, now balancing his new job and helping his mom with the preparations, was by her side every step of the way. The night of the exhibit, they stood together in the gallery, surrounded by Margaret's paintings. People walked up to her, admiring her work and asking about the stories behind each piece. Margaret felt a sense of fulfillment she had never experienced before. She wasn't just an artist. She was a mentor, a teacher, a part of something bigger than herself. As the evening drew to a close, Luke turned to her, his eyes shining with pride. "I told you, Mom. You've got this." Margaret smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. "We've got this," she said, looking at him. Together. The night of the gallery exhibit was a triumph, but it wasn't just Margaret's paintings that had left an impact. It was her story, her journey. People weren't just admiring the art. They were drawn to the woman behind it, her resilience, her strength, and her unyielding determination to overcome every obstacle in her path. The exhibit was a success beyond anything Margaret had imagined. As they left the gallery, Margaret felt as though the world had shifted just a little. She had spent so many years doubting herself, but tonight, surrounded by the admiration of strangers and friends alike, she realized that she had found something truly remarkable within herself. "Mom, you were amazing," Luke said, his voice full of pride as he wrapped his arm around her shoulders. Margaret smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her. "I couldn't have done it without you, Luke." Over the following weeks, Margaret's life began to change in ways she had never expected. The exposure from the gallery show led to more opportunities, interviews with local magazines, offers to teach art workshops at other venues, and even inquiries from larger galleries interested in displaying her work. For the first time in her life, Margaret felt like she was standing in the center of a whirlwind, and she was ready to embrace it. As her schedule grew busier, Luke became even more of a support. His new job in landscaping was going well, and he found himself enjoying the hands-on work, the satisfaction of seeing a project come to life. But it wasn't just the work that brought him peace, it was the balance. He no longer felt like he was sacrificing his own dreams in favor of his mother's. Luke knew that, despite the hurdles he had faced, this was his moment to carve out his own future. He had started talking to his friend about possibly expanding their business, and he was even considering taking some business courses to better understand the landscape industry. For the first time in years, he felt like he had a path forward, and Margaret's success only fueled that sense of possibility. A month after the exhibit, Margaret and Luke were invited to a community dinner, a gathering to celebrate local artists, business owners, and other achievers. It was the perfect occasion for Margaret to connect with more people in the community and share her story. As they walked into the event, Margaret could feel the shift in how people looked at her. Gone were the days when she felt invisible. Now, she was a local figure, someone whose work and resilience inspired others. At the dinner, a woman approached Margaret, a bright smile on her face. "I just wanted to say how much your work has touched me," she said, her voice warm. "I've been going through a tough time, and seeing your art, it gives me hope. It's like you captured what I've been feeling." Margaret blinked, taken aback by the woman's words. She had never imagined her art could have such an impact. "Thank you. That means more to me than you know." The woman nodded. "I've signed up for your next class, by the way. I can't wait to learn from you." Margaret's heart swelled with gratitude. "I'm looking forward to it," she said. The ripple effect of Margaret's success didn't stop with the gallery. It was spreading through her community, and her connection with the people she met became something far more profound than just professional. It was a web of shared experiences, of mutual growth, and of the strength found in opening up and letting others in. That night, as they sat together at the dinner table, Luke looked over at his mother, his heart full of admiration. She had always been his rock, but now, he saw her in an entirely new light. She wasn't just his mother. She was an inspiration, a living testament to the power of persistence and the ability to transform one's life no matter the age or circumstances. Margaret looked up from her plate and caught Luke's gaze. There was an unspoken understanding between them. They had both come so far. They had found each other again, rebuilt their relationship, and forged new paths that were uniquely their own. "You've done so much, Mom," Luke said softly. "I'm so proud of you." Margaret reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "I couldn't have done any of this without you, Luke. You helped me find my way back, and now we're both finding our way." Luke smiled, a weight lifting from his shoulders. For the first time in a long while, he felt truly free. The weeks that followed saw both Margaret and Luke continuing to grow. Margaret's name became synonymous with resilience and creativity in their town. Her classes flourished, and her artwork found its place in galleries far beyond the local level. She was even featured in a regional art magazine, and the recognition fueled her passion even more. Luke's landscaping business was also thriving. He was taking on more projects, his friend was teaching him the ropes of running a business, and slowly but surely, he was building his own success. He began to dream bigger, thinking about possibly expanding into a full-service landscaping and design firm. Together, they were becoming the people they had always hoped to be, fulfilled, driven, and surrounded by a community that believed in them. One evening, as they sat outside on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Margaret turned to Luke. "You know," she began, her voice thoughtful, "I never imagined I'd be here, living this life. It wasn't just about making it through. It was about finding joy in every step, in every challenge." Luke nodded, taking a deep breath. "I think we're finally living the life we were meant to live." And for the first time in a long while, both mother and son felt like they had arrived. A few months after the community dinner, life had settled into a rhythm that felt like it could last. Margaret was teaching a weekly art class that was quickly becoming the heart of her artistic career, and Luke's landscaping business was growing at a pace he could barely keep up with. He had even started hiring additional help, bringing in a few local workers, some of whom had been struggling to find steady work. In return, Luke was teaching them skills they could take into their own future projects. The small-town community he had once thought of as mundane now felt like the backbone of his and his mother's rebirth. One late afternoon, as Margaret was finishing up a painting in her studio, she received a phone call. It was from a well-known art dealer in a larger city. She hadn't been expecting this at all. "Mrs. Harris?" The voice on the other end said, its tone formal yet polite. "This is George Levinson from Levinson Art Gallery. I saw your recent show at the local gallery, and I must say, I was impressed. I'd love to discuss the possibility of displaying some of your works in our upcoming exhibition." Margaret's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't just any gallery. It was one of the most prestigious in the region. The opportunity to showcase her work in such a venue could change everything for her. "That sounds wonderful," Margaret managed, though her voice shook slightly with excitement. "I'd be honored." "Great," George said. "I'll be in touch soon to set up a meeting. And once again, your work is just stunning. We'd love to help you take the next step." When the call ended, Margaret leaned back in her chair, her heart racing. This was it. This was the moment she had been waiting for. Later that evening, as Margaret told Luke the good news, she could see the pride in his eyes. He had always been supportive of her, but tonight, there was something different about his smile. It was as if he could see her reaching new heights. "Mom, this is huge," Luke exclaimed. "This is your big break." Margaret shook her head, still in disbelief. "I don't know. I never expected anything like this. I just wanted to make art that felt true to me. But now, it feels like the universe is finally listening." Luke gave her a warm smile, the kind that came from deep understanding. "You've earned it, Mom. You've been working so hard. I'm proud of you, more than you know." As they sat together on the porch that evening, watching the sky slowly darken, Margaret felt a sense of gratitude wash over her. She had spent so many years doubting her abilities, wondering if she had any value beyond being Luke's caretaker. But now, after everything she had been through, after all the challenges and struggles, she knew she had something more to offer the world. She had her art, and in that, she had found a piece of herself that she had long since forgotten. The following week, Margaret and Luke traveled to the city for the meeting with the gallery owner. Margaret was both excited and nervous as they entered the sleek, modern gallery. The walls were lined with bold, colorful paintings, each more striking than the last. But what captured her attention more than anything was the way the gallery itself felt. Alive, full of potential, just like her. George Levinson was a man in his 50s, sharply dressed with a confident, yet approachable air. He welcomed them with a firm handshake and a warm smile. "Mrs. Harris, it's a pleasure to finally meet you. I've heard nothing but wonderful things about your work. Please, let's sit down and talk about the possibilities." As they sat across from each other, George began to explain the details of the upcoming exhibition. He described the venue, the audience, and the way he envisioned Margaret's work fitting into the larger narrative of the show. "I believe your art speaks to something universal," George said, his voice steady. "It's about resilience, strength, and the beauty found in overcoming life's challenges. That's the kind of work people are drawn to right now." Margaret listened intently, her nerves easing as George's words resonated with her. He understood her vision, understood what her art was truly about. For the first time in her life, Margaret realized that her art was more than just a reflection of herself. It was a reflection of all the struggles and triumphs of the human experience. And it was exactly what the world needed to see. As they left the gallery that day, Margaret's mind was buzzing with possibilities. But Luke, ever the grounding force in her life, placed a hand on her shoulder. "Mom, you're gonna do amazing things. I have no doubt about it." Margaret smiled, feeling a sense of peace settle in her heart. She had no idea where this new chapter would take her, but for the first time, she felt like she was truly stepping into her purpose. Back home, Luke's business continued to flourish as well. He had expanded his client base, taking on larger landscaping projects, and even working with local restaurants and hotels to enhance their outdoor spaces. He was beginning to realize that the work he was doing wasn't just about the paycheck. It was about the way it connected him to the community. He could see the difference he was making, not only in the way the town looked, but in the lives of the people he worked with. One evening, Luke came home to find his mother sitting in the living room, her face glowing with excitement. "Luke, I have news," she said, her voice filled with anticipation. "What's going on, Mom?" Luke asked, sensing the excitement in her tone. "I'm going to be part of a major exhibition," she exclaimed. "It's at the Levinson Art Gallery, and it's happening next month." Luke's face broke into a grin. "That's amazing, Mom. I knew this day was coming." Margaret beamed. "I couldn't have done it without you, Luke. You've supported me all along, and now I feel like I'm finally living the life I was meant to live." Luke took a step forward and hugged her tightly. "You're not just living it, Mom. You're owning it." As they stood there, holding each other, both mother and son felt an unspoken promise between them. No matter where life took them, they would face it together, stronger, braver, and more determined than ever. The day of the exhibition arrived, and Margaret could hardly believe how far she had come. The night before, she'd carefully selected the paintings she would showcase, packing them into protective covers with the same reverence she had always given her work. Luke had insisted on driving her to the city, offering to help her set up and make sure everything was perfect. "I still can't believe this is happening," Margaret said, staring out of the car window as they made their way to the gallery. The streets of the city had always seemed so far removed from her quiet town, but now, it felt like part of her life was becoming intertwined with this bustling, vibrant world. "You deserve it, Mom," Luke replied, glancing over at her with a grin. "I told you your time was coming. You just had to believe in it." Margaret smiled, the weight of Luke's words sinking in deeper. She had doubted herself for so long, questioning her talent, wondering if she was truly worthy of this. But now, seeing the support from her son, she knew that it wasn't just her art that mattered. It was the passion, the dedication, and the love she poured into each stroke, and the world was ready for it. As they arrived at the Levinson Art Gallery, the sight of it took Margaret's breath away. The large glass doors opened to a sleek, modern space, with bright white walls that seemed to invite each painting to speak for itself. The air smelled of fresh flowers and polished wood, and there was an almost palpable sense of anticipation in the room. People milled about, chatting quietly, while a string quartet played softly in the background. Margaret felt a rush of nervous energy, but it was the kind of nerves that came with excitement, not fear. George Levinson, the gallery owner, was already there to greet them, his friendly face breaking into a warm smile as they entered. "Margaret, Luke, welcome," he said, extending his hand. "It's so great to see you both. We're thrilled to have your work here tonight." Margaret shook his hand, trying to steady her racing heart. "I can't believe it's finally happening," she said. "Thank you so much for this opportunity." "It's our pleasure," George replied. "Your work has already been drawing attention, and I know tonight will only elevate that. Let's get your pieces set up, and then you can enjoy the night. There will be collectors here, buyers, and even some art critics." This is your moment. As they moved toward the area where Margaret's paintings were displayed, Luke helped her carefully hang each piece. It wasn't just about the art. This was a statement, a declaration that Margaret Harris had arrived. Each painting was a reflection of her life, of the struggles and triumphs, the quiet moments and the loud ones. Some were abstract, filled with splashes of color that seemed to pulse with energy. Others were portraits of faces she had known, family, friends, and even strangers whose stories had touched her heart. Once everything was in place, the crowd began to gather. People admired the works, many of them pausing to linger before the vibrant pieces. Margaret's heart soared as she saw them absorbed in the art, connecting with it in ways she hadn't anticipated. "This is amazing, Mom," Luke said as they watched the crowd. He was beaming with pride, and Margaret could see it in his eyes. This was a moment they would both remember forever. As the night wore on, Margaret found herself in conversation after conversation with gallery-goers, some of whom were eager to know more about her process and her inspiration. She spoke about her journey, about the hardships she had faced, and how painting had been both a sanctuary and a form of expression. "I never knew I had this much to say," she told one woman, her voice filled with emotion. "Art gave me a way to speak when words couldn't." The woman smiled warmly. "That's the beauty of art. It speaks for us when we can't find the words. And yours, Margaret, speaks volumes." Around the room, people whispered excitedly about Margaret's paintings. Luke, watching from a distance, felt a surge of emotion. He had always known his mother was talented, but this was something bigger. This was proof that her talent was not just a gift to her, but to everyone who was fortunate enough to experience it. Margaret felt a tap on her shoulder, turning to find George standing behind her, looking even more excited than she felt. "Margaret, I have some incredible news," he said, his eyes twinkling. "We've already had interest from several buyers, and I think this is just the beginning. People are absolutely loving your work." Margaret blinked, overwhelmed by the turn of events. "Buyers? Really?" "Yes." George laughed. "I've had several people approach me about purchasing your pieces. They're eager to add your work to their collections. One collector from New York even asked if we could arrange a private viewing for a future sale." Luke's eyes widened as he overheard the conversation. "Mom, I can't believe it," Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion. "This is more than I ever imagined. It's not just the money. It's that people are connecting with my work." George smiled. "That's what it's all about, Margaret. Your art isn't just decorative, it's meaningful. And people are recognizing that." As the evening continued, Margaret felt a sense of fulfillment she hadn't known before. This wasn't just about recognition or financial success. It was about being seen, truly seen, for who she was and what she had to offer. She had spent so many years hidden in the shadows, doubting herself and her abilities. But tonight, she stood in the light, her art speaking for her in ways she could never have imagined. Luke came over to her later in the evening, and without saying a word, he pulled her into a hug. "I'm so proud of you, Mom," he whispered. "This is just the beginning." Margaret smiled, tears threatening to fall. "I never thought this day would come, but now that it has, I'm ready for whatever comes next." As the gallery event wound down and the last few guests trickled out, Margaret and Luke stood outside the building, looking out at the city lights. Margaret turned to Luke, her heart full. "This isn't just my success, Luke. It's ours. We've both worked so hard to get here." Luke smiled back at her, his eyes shining. "We've only just begun, Mom. Together, we can do anything." And with that, Margaret knew that her life and her future were no longer limited by what she had once believed. She had found her place in the world, and it was only getting bigger. The days following the art exhibition were a whirlwind for Margaret. The gallery received several inquiries about her paintings, and before she knew it, her art had become the talk of the town. The buzz was so intense that a local news station wanted to feature her in a segment. Margaret couldn't quite believe it. Just a few months ago, she had been quietly painting in her studio, unsure whether anyone would ever see her work. Now, she was preparing for interviews and press appearances. Luke, ever the supportive son, was right by her side. He had taken on the role of her unofficial manager, handling phone calls, emails, and even arranging her schedule. Margaret had never imagined that her art could lead her down this path, but with Luke's help, she was taking it all in stride. "I don't know what to say," Margaret confessed one evening as she sat in the living room with Luke. The weight of it all was starting to sink in. "You don't have to say anything," Luke replied with a grin. "Just keep doing what you're doing. People love it, and it's clear that you were meant to be here." Margaret smiled, but something deep inside still felt uneasy. Success was so new to her, so foreign. She had spent years convincing herself that she was just a woman with a passion, never expecting it to turn into anything more. Now, the world was starting to notice, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for the attention. "You're right, Luke," she said, but her voice was tinged with uncertainty. "But it's so overwhelming. I feel like I'm constantly playing catch-up, trying to keep up with all these new opportunities." Luke's expression softened. "I get it, Mom, but you don't have to do it alone. I'm here to help. You've worked your whole life for this moment. It's time to enjoy it." Margaret nodded, though she still couldn't shake the feeling that there was more she needed to do. The next few weeks were a blur of meetings, interviews, and gallery showings. Margaret had even started to receive invitations to exhibit her paintings in other cities. She was being offered opportunities she never dreamed would come her way. Yet, with each new offer, a growing sense of doubt gnawed at her. One evening, after a particularly long day, Margaret found herself alone in the studio, staring at her latest painting. It was vibrant, full of bold colors and sweeping brushstrokes, but for some reason, it didn't feel complete. She felt disconnected from it, as though the work wasn't truly hers. "You're thinking too much," she whispered to herself. "Just let it flow. Don't overthink it." But as she tried to pick up the brush again, her hands trembled. What had once been a source of joy was now a source of anxiety. Was she truly good enough to be in the spotlight? Could she keep up with the demands of her newfound success? The following morning, Luke noticed the change in her. Margaret had always been strong, confident, even in the face of adversity. But now, she seemed distracted, lost in thought. "Mom, is everything okay?" he asked gently. Margaret hesitated. "I don't know, Luke. I feel like I'm in over my head. I've never had to juggle so many opportunities at once. What if I fail?" Luke walked over to her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You won't fail. Not because of the pressure, but because you've already proven that you can do this. This is just another chapter, another step. You've got this." Margaret looked up at him, her eyes filled with doubt. "But what if I don't? What if it's all just too much?" Luke smiled, the same warm, reassuring smile he had given her since he was a child. "It's okay to feel overwhelmed, Mom. You've never had this much attention before, but you've got the strength, and more importantly, you have me, and I believe in you. All I want is for you to keep doing what you love, because that's what's going to get you through this." Margaret felt a tear slip down her cheek. She hadn't realized how much she needed to hear those words until now. "I'll try," she whispered, feeling a little more at ease. Later that week, Margaret received an invitation she couldn't ignore. A prestigious art fair in New York City had reached out, wanting her to display her work. It was the opportunity of a lifetime, but it also came with an enormous amount of pressure. The thought of traveling to such a huge city, surrounded by so many talented artists, was daunting. "Mom, this is huge," Luke said when they sat down to discuss the invitation. "This is the kind of opportunity that could change everything. New York is where artists make their mark." "I know," Margaret replied, a mixture of excitement and fear in her voice. "But I'm not sure I'm ready. It's one thing to be appreciated locally, but New York, it's like the center of the art world." Luke took a deep breath. "That's exactly why you need to go. You've already made a name for yourself here. Now, it's time to show the world what you've got." Margaret took a long pause, looking out the window at the garden where she'd spent so many quiet hours painting. She had come so far, and now she was at a crossroads. She could continue with her comfortable, quiet life, or she could take a leap into the unknown, where anything was possible. "I'll do it," she finally said, her voice steady. "I'll go to New York." Luke grinned, his pride evident. "I knew you would." In the days that followed, Margaret and Luke worked tirelessly to prepare. She spent hours carefully packing her artwork, making sure each piece was protected and ready for transport. Luke arranged for the logistics of the trip, booking flights, and making sure they had a place to stay in the city. As the day of the flight approached, Margaret couldn't help but feel a sense of exhilaration mixed with fear. This was more than just a trip to showcase her art. It was a step into a new chapter of her life. "Are you nervous?" Luke asked as they sat together at the airport, waiting for their flight. "A little," Margaret admitted, her voice soft, "but I think it's the good kind of nervous. The kind that means I'm about to do something important." Luke nodded. "You are, Mom. And whatever happens, you've already made it. You've already succeeded." Margaret smiled at him, feeling a wave of gratitude. She had never dreamed she would find herself here, on the verge of something so big. But with her son by her side, she knew that no matter what happened in New York, she was ready for whatever came next. New York City was everything Margaret had imagined, and more. The towering skyscrapers, the bustling streets, the energy that never seemed to sleep. It was like stepping into a different world. As soon as she and Luke arrived, Margaret felt both exhilarated and overwhelmed. There was so much happening around them, so much noise, so much life. Yet, amid the hustle and bustle, she couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of awe. This was where dreams were made, where artists found their place in the world. Their first stop was the art fair, where Margaret's work would be showcased. It was held in a sleek, modern gallery space, a place filled with light and vast white walls, perfect for displaying the vibrant paintings she had spent years perfecting. As they entered, Margaret's heart raced. There were so many artists, so many styles, and so much talent on display. It was both inspiring and intimidating. Luke noticed the look on his mother's face. He could tell she was starting to feel the weight of the situation. "You're going to do great," he reassured her, squeezing her hand. "Remember, you belong here. Your art speaks for itself." Margaret nodded, trying to calm the nervous fluttering in her chest. It wasn't just the size of the event that had her on edge. It was the thought of competing with artists she had always admired from afar. She wasn't used to being in the spotlight, and now here she was, among some of the best. The event began, and the room filled with people. The soft murmur of conversations and the clicking of cameras created an almost surreal atmosphere. Margaret had been introduced to a few fellow artists, some of whom were eager to meet her. She smiled politely, but all she could think about was how small she felt standing in front of her own paintings. As the hours passed, her nerves didn't ease. She watched as people lingered in front of other booths, admiring the works on display, but she couldn't shake the feeling that no one was stopping by hers. A pang of doubt began to creep in. Luke, noticing her unease, leaned over and whispered, "Mom, let's take a break. You've been on your feet all day, and you're overthinking it. People are going to come by. You've got time." Margaret agreed, grateful for the chance to step away. She and Luke found a quiet corner where they could sit and take a moment to relax. Margaret's mind was racing. What if her art wasn't good enough? What if the critics didn't like it? What if she'd made a mistake coming here? Luke watched her closely, his voice gentle. "You've worked your whole life for this. You've already proven you have what it takes. You just need to trust in your own work." Margaret sighed, staring down at her hands. "It's just hard, Luke. This world, this city, it's so different. And everyone here seems so confident, so sure of themselves." "You're not alone," Luke reminded her. "You have me, and you have your art. That's all you need." Margaret smiled at him, feeling a wave of gratitude. She had always felt like the underdog, never quite fitting in, never fully believing in her own worth. But looking at Luke, seeing the unwavering belief he had in her, she realized that maybe she didn't have to prove anything to anyone except herself. After their break, they returned to the gallery, and to Margaret's surprise, things began to change. More and more people started to notice her work. A local art critic approached her, struck by the emotion and depth in her paintings. "These are exceptional," he said with genuine admiration. "There's a rawness to them, a sincerity that's rare to find." Margaret felt a surge of pride, but it was tempered by a familiar doubt. Could she truly keep this up? Could she keep making art that mattered? As if reading her thoughts, the critic added, Your paintings speak volumes. The world needs to hear your voice." Those words, simple as they were, made all the difference. Margaret didn't know if she was ready for everything that was happening, but she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't turn back now. As the day came to a close, Margaret and Luke stood outside the gallery, the New York skyline stretching out before them. The city was still buzzing with life, the lights sparkling like a million stars. Luke turned to her, his eyes filled with pride. "You did it, Mom. You made it here, and you're making an impact." Margaret smiled, but it was a quiet, reflective smile. "I don't know if I've made it yet, Luke, but I've taken the first step, and that's more than I ever imagined I could do." She looked up at the towering buildings, feeling the weight of the city on her shoulders, but also the sense of possibility that came with it. For the first time, she felt like she was on the edge of something bigger than herself. "What now?" Luke asked, his voice full of anticipation. Margaret turned to him, a spark of determination in her eyes. "Now, we keep going. We take it one step at a time." As they walked away from the gallery, the sounds of the city filled the air, and for the first time in a long while, Margaret felt a sense of hope. Whatever came next, she was ready. The next day, the art fair wrapped up. Margaret's work had garnered more attention than she had ever dreamed, with several pieces sold and many more inquiries for future exhibitions. It was a success, but it was only the beginning. The days following the art fair were a whirlwind for Margaret. The success of her first major showcase in New York was more than she had ever hoped for. Several of her paintings had sold, and she had been approached by a well-known gallery owner who expressed interest in representing her. The idea of having her work displayed in one of New York's prestigious galleries seemed like a dream come true. Yet, as the excitement of the event settled, Margaret found herself feeling more overwhelmed than triumphant. It wasn't the recognition she had sought that was weighing on her. It was the pressure of what was to come. Could she keep up the momentum? Could she deliver work that lived up to this newfound attention? One evening, as Margaret sat in the small studio apartment Luke had rented for them, she gazed out the window at the city's lights. The view was stunning, but it was difficult to enjoy when her mind kept racing with questions and doubts. Luke, sensing his mother's unease, walked into the room holding a cup of tea. He placed it on the small table beside her and sat down. "You're thinking too much again," he said gently, taking a seat beside her. Margaret let out a small sigh, accepting the tea with a grateful smile. "I don't know how to explain it, Luke. Everything is happening so fast. The gallery, the press inquiries, the new commissions. It's more than I ever imagined, but it's also intimidating. What if I can't live up to it all?" Luke's eyes softened, and he placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You've been through a lot to get here. You've always done what you said you would do, and you're not doing this alone. You have me, and you have your art. I believe in you, and I know this is only the beginning." Margaret looked at him, the weight of his words sinking in. In all the years of her struggle, she had often felt alone. But with Luke by her side, things were different. He was her rock, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe in the possibility of what could come next. The following morning, Margaret received a phone call that would change everything. It was from the gallery owner, a woman named Susan Carrington, who had shown interest in her work at the art fair. "Margaret, I hope you're doing well. I wanted to let you know that after seeing your paintings in person, I'm more convinced than ever that your work deserves a wider audience. I'd like to offer you the chance to have a solo exhibition at my gallery." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. A solo exhibition? In one of New York's most renowned galleries? The offer was overwhelming, but at the same time, it felt like the ultimate validation. "I don't know what to say," Margaret replied, her voice trembling with emotion. "This is beyond anything I could have imagined." "I can see the depth in your work, Margaret. It speaks to something real, something that people need to see. Let's set up a time to discuss the details. I'm excited to make this happen." After hanging up the phone, Margaret sat in stunned silence, trying to process what had just happened. This was it. This was the breakthrough she had been working for her entire life. But even as the excitement surged through her, a part of her remained anxious. Was she ready? Could she really pull this off? Luke, noticing the quiet air of contemplation that had settled over his mother, entered the room. "What's going on? What did Susan say?" Margaret looked up at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. "She wants me to have a solo exhibition at her gallery. It's really happening, Luke. It's all happening." Luke's face lit up with pride and excitement. "That's amazing, Mom. You've earned it. You've worked your whole life for this moment." Margaret smiled, but her anxiety crept back in. "I don't know if I can do it. A solo exhibition? It's huge. What if it doesn't work? What if my paintings don't resonate with the public the way they did at the fair?" Luke sat beside her, his presence a calming force. "You've already made it this far. You have everything you need to succeed. And no matter what happens, I'll be here with you. We'll do it together." Margaret felt her shoulders relax for the first time that day. Luke's unwavering support was the anchor she needed. With him by her side, she realized that she didn't have to be perfect. She only had to keep going, keep creating, and trust in herself. Over the next few weeks, Margaret worked tirelessly in the studio, pouring her heart and soul into every brushstroke. The pressure of the solo exhibition was unlike anything she had ever experienced. But with each piece she completed, she felt more confident in her ability to bring her vision to life. Luke was there every step of the way, helping with logistics, offering his feedback on the paintings, and supporting her emotionally when she needed it most. There were moments when Margaret felt like giving up, moments when the fear of failure threatened to overwhelm her. But Luke's belief in her never wavered, and that made all the difference. The day of the exhibition finally arrived, and as Margaret stood in front of the gallery, her heart raced with anticipation. This was the moment she had worked so hard for. The crowd that had gathered outside was buzzing with excitement, and inside, the gallery space gleamed with polished floors and well-lit walls. Margaret took a deep breath, feeling a wave of gratitude and fear wash over her in equal measure. She had come so far, but now, as the doors opened and people began to stream in, she realized that she was ready to embrace the future, whatever it held. Luke stood beside her, his eyes filled with pride as he watched his mother take her place among the best. "You did it," he whispered. "You've made it." Margaret smiled, feeling the weight of his words and the truth behind them. This was just the beginning, and she was ready for whatever came next. The opening night of Margaret's solo exhibition was a resounding success, or at least, that's how it appeared on the surface. The gallery was filled with art enthusiasts, critics, and collectors who had come to witness the debut of an artist they were all eager to learn more about. Margaret stood near the entrance, her heart pounding in her chest as she watched the crowd move through the gallery, examining her work with keen eyes. Luke, ever the supportive presence, was by her side. He smiled at the guests, occasionally offering them a glass of champagne, but his focus was mostly on Margaret. He could see the tension in her posture, the way her eyes darted nervously between each conversation, each admiring look. "Mom, you've done it," he said quietly, his voice filled with pride. "They're all talking about your work." Margaret forced a smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "It's too much, Luke. What if they don't like it? What if I'm not good enough?" Luke shook his head, the reassurance in his voice clear. "You are more than good enough. You're incredible. Just look around you." Margaret took a deep breath and turned to face the crowd again. The glowing lights illuminated her paintings, each piece telling a story of its own. The colors, the textures, the raw emotion captured in every brushstroke. They were all a reflection of her struggles and triumphs, of the woman who had fought for so long to be seen. But as the evening wore on, Margaret began to feel the weight of everyone's gaze, the invisible pressure to be perfect. Every compliment, every admiring comment, seemed to add another layer to the already mounting expectation. She had achieved so much, but the fear of failure, the fear of letting people down, gnawed at her. At one point, a well-dressed woman approached Margaret with a polite smile. "I must say, I'm quite taken with your work. There's a depth to your paintings that's hard to describe. Have you ever thought about creating a series that addresses more current social issues? I think you'd have quite an impact." Margaret nodded politely, but inside, she felt a knot tighten in her stomach. Social issues? She had poured her soul into these pieces, creating them from a deeply personal place. The idea of turning her art into something political felt wrong to her, but she didn't know how to express that without sounding defensive. "I'm grateful for the feedback," Margaret said, forcing a smile. "But my work is more about personal expression and the emotions I feel. I don't want to limit myself to a specific message." The woman seemed slightly taken aback, but nodded in understanding before walking away. Luke, who had been watching the exchange from a distance, noticed his mother's discomfort. He walked over to her, concern in his eyes. "What's going on? You don't look like yourself." Margaret sighed, her shoulders heavy with the weight of expectations. "I feel like I'm being pulled in 100 different directions. People keep offering their opinions about what I should be doing with my art, and I'm starting to lose sight of why I started this in the first place." Luke placed a hand on her shoulder, offering the familiar comfort she had grown to rely on. "You've come this far because you stayed true to yourself. Don't let anyone take that from you. The right people will appreciate your work for what it is, not what they think it should be." Margaret met his gaze, her eyes filled with gratitude. "I don't know what I'd do without you, Luke." He smiled. "You do just fine, but it's a lot easier with me by your side, isn't it?" She chuckled softly, feeling the tension in her chest ease just a little. For the rest of the evening, Margaret focused on her guests, engaging in conversation, answering questions about her paintings, and slowly allowing herself to enjoy the night. The compliments kept coming, but with each one, she reminded herself to stay grounded in her vision. As the evening drew to a close, Margaret found herself standing alone for a moment in front of her favorite painting in the gallery. A large piece that featured a swirling mix of colors, capturing the essence of both chaos and serenity. It was the painting she had struggled with the most, but also the one she was most proud of. It was a representation of her journey, the battles she had fought, and the peace she had found within herself. She stood there, contemplating the painting, when a voice interrupted her thoughts. "It's my favorite, too." Margaret turned to see Susan Carrington, the gallery owner, standing beside her. The older woman's expression was one of admiration as she took in the painting. "You've created something truly unique, Margaret. I'm thrilled with how the exhibition turned out. Your work resonates with so many people." Margaret smiled, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and relief. "Thank you, Susan. It means a lot to hear that." Susan studied the painting for a moment longer before turning to Margaret with a serious look in her eyes. "I have a proposition for you. Your exhibition tonight has garnered quite a bit of attention. Several collectors have already expressed interest in purchasing your work. But beyond that, I think you're ready for something bigger." Margaret raised an eyebrow, curious. "What do you mean?" "I'd like to help you get a permanent exhibit space in the gallery," Susan said. "We've been representing artists for years, but I truly believe you have the potential to reach a much wider audience. This could be a game changer for you." Margaret's heart raced. This was everything she had dreamed of, everything she had worked so hard for. But at the same time, a small part of her recoiled. Could she handle the pressure of this level of success? Was she ready to take on even more responsibility? Before she could answer, Luke appeared beside her, sensing her hesitation. He gave her a reassuring smile. "Mom, you've earned this. You're ready." Margaret took a deep breath, then turned back to Susan. "I'd love to discuss it more. Let's set up a time to meet." Susan smiled, her eyes gleaming with excitement. "I'll have my assistant call you to arrange a meeting." "Congratulations again, Margaret. You've truly outdone yourself." As Susan walked away, Margaret turned to Luke, her eyes wide with disbelief. "I don't know if I can do this, Luke. It's so much. What if I mess it up?" Luke placed a hand on her arm, grounding her. "You won't mess it up. You're exactly where you're supposed to be." Margaret smiled, feeling the weight of his words settle over her. No matter the pressure, no matter the fear, she had come this far. And with Luke by her side, she was ready to face whatever came next. Margaret sat in the quiet of her studio the next morning, her eyes fixed on the phone in her hand. The excitement of the previous night's success had faded, replaced by a swirling storm of doubt. The gallery exhibition had been everything she had hoped for, and more. Yet, with the offer from Susan still fresh in her mind, She couldn't shake the nagging fear that now clung to her like a second skin. "Are you sure you're ready for this, Margaret?" she whispered to herself, staring at the phone number she had yet to call. What if it's all too much? She stood up abruptly, pacing the floor of her studio. Her mind raced, conjuring images of what this new opportunity could mean. Larger exhibits, more attention, more expectations. It was everything she had dreamed of, but now that it was within reach, the fear of failure loomed larger than ever. It wasn't that she doubted her talent. She had proven to herself, time and again, that she was capable. But the weight of success, that was something entirely different. What if she couldn't handle the pressure? What if people expected her to keep getting better, to never fail, to always be the person they had seen the night before? Margaret sat back down, her fingers shaking as she dialed the number. The phone rang once, twice, and then a voice on the other end answered. "Good morning, Margaret. This is Susan. I'm so glad you called." Margaret swallowed hard, trying to steady her breathing. "Hi, Susan. I wanted to talk about your offer." Susan's voice remained warm and confident. "Of course. I'm so excited to hear from you. I truly believe this is the right move for you. Your work has made a lasting impression on so many people, and this gallery space would be an amazing way for you to continue growing." Margaret hesitated. She had worked her whole life to reach this point, yet now that it was here, it felt almost too big. "Susan, I'm flattered. I really am. But I have to be honest with you. I'm scared. This is a huge step, and I'm not sure I'm ready for it. What if I fail?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Susan spoke gently, her tone filled with understanding. "Margaret, I know exactly how you feel. This is a big opportunity, and it's natural to be afraid. But let me ask you something. Do you want this? Do you want to see your art in galleries all over the world?" Margaret's heart raced at the thought. She did want it. She had worked for it, dreamed of it. But could she handle it? Could she maintain her sense of self in the midst of it all? "I do," she admitted quietly. "But I don't know if I'm strong enough to carry that kind of responsibility." Susan's voice softened, her words steady and encouraging. "Margaret, you've already proven yourself. You've come this far because of your passion, your vision, and your talent. It's not about being perfect. It's about staying true to yourself. You don't need to carry this burden alone. You have people around you who believe in you, including me. I believe you can handle this because you're not afraid to take risks. And that's what will make your success all the more meaningful." Margaret's heart swelled with emotion. She had spent so much of her life doubting herself, questioning her worth, but Susan's words reminded her of something important. She wasn't alone. She had people who cared about her, who believed in her. And most importantly, she had her own strength. "Thank you, Susan," Margaret said, her voice filled with determination. "I'm ready. Let's do it." A smile spread across Susan's face, even though Margaret couldn't see it. "I'm so glad to hear that. I'll make the arrangements for our meeting. This is the beginning of something incredible, Margaret. Trust me." After hanging up, Margaret sat quietly for a moment, her thoughts still swirling. But something had changed. The fear hadn't completely disappeared, but it no longer felt insurmountable. For the first time in a long time, she felt ready to face the challenge ahead. Luke found her later that evening, sitting in the same spot she had been earlier, but now there was a calmness in her expression that had been absent before. When he entered the room, he paused, noticing the change. "You did it, didn't you?" he asked, his voice laced with curiosity. Margaret nodded, smiling softly. "I did. I told Susan I'm ready. I'm taking the offer." Luke's eyes widened with pride. "That's amazing, Mom. I knew you would. You've always been stronger than you give yourself credit for." Margaret laughed, though there was a trace of vulnerability in her voice. "I'm still scared, Luke. I don't know what the future holds, and I'm terrified I might fail. But I know that if I don't take this chance, I'll regret it forever." "You won't fail," Luke said firmly, walking over to her and sitting beside her. "You've already won, Mom. Every painting, every struggle. It's all led to this, and I'm with you every step of the way." Margaret's eyes glistened as she looked at her son, feeling a wave of gratitude wash over her. "I don't know how I would have gotten here without you." Luke smiled, his expression soft and sincere. You would have gotten here, Mom. You just wouldn't have known how strong you are. For the first time in a long time, Margaret felt a deep sense of peace settle in her heart. She wasn't just stepping into a new chapter of her career. She was stepping into a new chapter of her life. A life where fear didn't control her, where she could embrace the possibilities before her with courage. And as the gallery lights dimmed and the last of the guests departed, Margaret knew that no matter what came next, she had everything she needed to succeed. The days that followed were a whirlwind. Margaret had agreed to the gallery offer, and now, the reality of her decision was setting in. There were meetings to attend, contracts to sign, and preparations to make. But as the excitement began to mount, so did the pressure. She stood in front of the mirror, trying to steady her hands as she adjusted her blazer. The reflection staring back at her was not the confident woman she had hoped to see, but someone still caught in the grip of self-doubt. The phone rang, cutting through her thoughts. Margaret snatched it up, hoping it was Susan with more details. Instead, it was a call she had been avoiding for weeks. "Hello?" she answered, her voice betraying a hint of hesitation. "Margaret," came the familiar voice of her ex-husband, Harold. "I need to talk to you about Luke." Margaret's heart tightened. She hadn't spoken to Harold in months, and every time his name surfaced, she felt a rush of emotions: anger, hurt, confusion. "What about Luke?" she asked cautiously. "He's been distant lately." Harold's voice took on a more serious tone. "I think you need to have a conversation with him. He's been avoiding us, and I'm worried." Margaret's chest tightened. Luke had been acting strange lately, but she hadn't connected the dots. He had become more withdrawn, spending long hours at the studio, lost in his own world. She had chalked it up to the pressures of school, but now, hearing Harold's words, a gnawing feeling of concern began to rise within her. "I'll talk to him," she said, her voice soft but resolute. "Thanks for letting me know." After hanging up, Margaret stared at the phone, the weight of her responsibility pressing down on her. It wasn't just her career she had to focus on now. Luke was her priority. He always had been. But as the days passed, her conversations with Luke seemed to fall short. When she tried to approach him, he was either too busy or too distracted. It was as if he was building walls around himself, and no matter how hard Margaret tried, she couldn't break through. One evening, after a long day of meetings and gallery preparations, Margaret found Luke sitting alone in his room, headphones on, the faint hum of music drifting into the hallway. She knocked gently on the door, pushing it open when she didn't get a response. "Look," she called softly, walking in. He didn't move, but she could see the subtle tension in his shoulders. "What's going on?" she asked, trying to keep her voice calm. "You've been distant lately." Luke finally pulled the headphones off and turned to face her, his eyes a little too guarded. "I'm fine, Mom. Just busy." Margaret sat down beside him, her heart heavy with concern. "I know you, Luke. You're not fine. What's going on?" For a long moment, Luke didn't say anything. Margaret could see him wrestling with something he wasn't ready to share. But Margaret wasn't going to back down. She had spent so many years trying to protect him from the world, but she realized now that maybe she needed to let him face it on his own terms. "I'm just worried, Mom," Luke finally confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I'm doing the right thing. I see you working so hard, and I feel like I'm just standing still, like I'm not good enough." Margaret's heart cracked at his words. "Luke, you are more than enough. I see how hard you're trying, but you don't have to carry everything on your own. You don't have to be perfect for me, for anyone. But what if I'm not enough for myself?" Luke whispered, his voice breaking. "What if I never find out what I'm really meant to do?" Margaret reached out and took his hand, squeezing it gently. "You are already enough, Luke. I've watched you grow into an amazing young man. You don't have to have all the answers right now. No one does. You'll figure it out, and I'll be here every step of the way." She saw the tears in his eyes, the vulnerability that he rarely allowed anyone to see. But Margaret didn't shy away from it. She knew what it was like to feel uncertain, to feel like the world was pressing down on you, asking for more than you could give. She had been there herself, so many times. "You're not alone, Luke," she continued softly. "We're in this together. I believe in you." Luke didn't say anything more, but Margaret could feel the weight lifting off his shoulders. He leaned against her, his head resting on her shoulder as the silence between them settled into something more peaceful. Margaret kissed the top of his head, feeling a rush of warmth in her chest. She had always been the one to guide him, but today, in this moment, she realized that he had been guiding her too. The love between them was a silent, unspoken bond that transcended any words. But even as she held her son, there was a nagging feeling at the back of her mind. The pressure of the gallery, the looming deadlines, the expectations of others, it all felt like it was pushing her to her limits. She wasn't sure how much longer she could keep juggling everything. Would she be able to balance her career with being the mother Luke needed? And as her thoughts swirled in uncertainty, one thing became clear. No matter what challenges lay ahead, Margaret knew that the bond between her and Luke was the one thing that would never falter. The following days brought a quiet calm to the household, but Margaret's mind remained restless. She had watched Luke open up in a way he hadn't before, and though that gave her hope, it didn't solve the underlying problem. The pressure of her commitments weighed heavily on her shoulders. Between preparing for the gallery's grand opening and managing the complexities of her personal life, she was starting to feel stretched thin. It was early one morning when she found herself standing in the kitchen, brewing coffee, her thoughts lost in the endless to-do lists scrolling through her mind. The soft hum of the kettle broke her trance, and she turned just in time to see Luke entering the room, his hair still messy from sleep. "Good morning, Mom," he greeted her, his voice still thick with sleep, but there was something different in his tone, something lighter. "Good morning," Margaret smiled, offering him a warm cup of coffee. "How did you sleep?" "Better," Luke said, sitting at the kitchen table, his fingers absent-mindedly tapping the surface. "I've been thinking about what you said the other day, about not needing to have it all figured out." Margaret's heart swelled with pride. She could see the shift in him. The burden of self-doubt wasn't gone, but there was a new spark of determination in his eyes. "I'm glad to hear that," she replied gently, settling across from him with her own cup of coffee. "You don't need to rush, Luke. Life's not a race." He nodded, but then, after a beat of silence, he met her gaze. "You're right. I think I need to take a step back and just figure things out on my own. Maybe spend more time with my art, you know? Focus on something that feels real to me." Margaret felt a wave of relief wash over her. "That sounds like a great idea. You're more than capable of creating something beautiful with your own hands." Luke smiled faintly, and for the first time in weeks, there was a sense of peace about him. The tension that had clung to him seemed to dissipate, replaced with something more hopeful. But just as Margaret thought they had reached a quiet understanding, her phone buzzed on the counter. She glanced at it, the name on the screen sending a quick surge of anxiety through her chest. It was Susan, her gallery contact. "I've been meaning to talk to you." Susan's voice crackled through the phone as Margaret answered, her mind already racing. "The exhibition is coming up fast, and we need to finalize some of the details. There's a potential investor who's interested in your work, and they want a preview. Are you available to meet this afternoon?" Margaret's stomach dropped. The timing was terrible. She had just begun to find some balance with Luke, but now she was being pulled back into the whirlwind of her career. I'll be there," Margaret said, trying to mask the fatigue in her voice. "What time?" 2 o'clock sharp. "Don't be late," Susan urged, before hanging up. Margaret exhaled slowly, turning to Luke. "I've got to go to the gallery this afternoon. They're arranging a meeting with a potential investor." Luke nodded, but his expression was unreadable. It was clear he understood, but Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that he was still unsure about everything. "Okay, I'll be fine," he said quietly, but Margaret could hear the uncertainty behind his words. "Look, she started, but he cut her off. "I know, Mom," he said, standing up and walking toward her. "You don't have to worry about me. I'm not a kid anymore." Margaret felt a pang in her chest at his words. He wasn't a child, but sometimes he needed her more than he realized. "I just want to make sure you're okay, that's all." Luke paused, his gaze softening. "I'm figuring things out. I promise." The air between them was thick with unspoken words. Margaret wanted to say more, but she knew the time had come for her to step away, even if only for a few hours. Her career was moving forward, and the opportunity was too important to pass up. "Okay," she said softly. "I'll be back before you know it. We'll talk more when I get home, all right?" Luke offered a small smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes but was enough to reassure Margaret that he would be all right. "I'll be here," he said, his voice steady. Margaret grabbed her bag and keys, giving Luke one last glance before walking out the door. As she pulled away from the house, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was amiss. She had always balanced her career and her family with careful precision, but now, with everything changing, she wondered if she could still manage both worlds without losing herself in the process. The meeting at the gallery was a blur of handshakes, business talk, and promises of future success. The investor, a sharply dressed man with cold eyes, was all business, asking about her vision, her plans, her goals. But the whole time, Margaret couldn't stop thinking about Luke. She couldn't shake the feeling that he was still hiding something, still holding back. When the meeting finally ended, she stepped outside, taking a deep breath of the cool air. The sky was overcast, the clouds heavy with the promise of rain. Margaret felt a weight on her chest, as though the storm brewing in the sky mirrored the one inside her. She glanced at her phone. A message from Luke flashed on the screen. "Can we talk when you get home?" Her heart skipped a beat. What was going on? Margaret started the car, her mind racing as she headed back to the house, the unknown hanging in the air like a dark cloud. The drive home felt longer than usual. Margaret couldn't shake the tension that had settled into her chest. The weather had turned, the gray clouds heavy with the possibility of rain. It mirrored her emotions, the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her. She had been so absorbed in the world of art and career, she had scarcely noticed how much Luke had been retreating into himself. He had shown progress, but now, after reading his message, she wondered if there was something more going on beneath the surface. When she finally pulled into the driveway, the house was quiet. But there was an undeniable heaviness in the air. Margaret stepped out of the car and walked up to the door, hesitating for a moment before unlocking it. As soon as she entered, she was met with silence. "Look," she called, her voice uncertain. She walked through the living room, her eyes scanning for any sign of him. It wasn't until she reached the kitchen that she found him, sitting at the table, his hands clenched into fists, staring down at the empty surface. Margaret's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't looking up, wasn't acknowledging her presence. She set her bag down, her thoughts racing as she approached him slowly. "Look," she said again, her voice softer this time. "What's going on?" He didn't answer at first, his eyes still fixed on the table. Margaret stood beside him, her hand gently resting on his shoulder. "You said you wanted to talk." He exhaled sharply, finally meeting her gaze. The look in his eyes made her stomach tighten. It was a mix of frustration, vulnerability, and something else, something she couldn't quite place. "I don't know how to say this," Luke began, his voice hoarse. "I've been feeling like I'm drowning, Mom." Margaret's heart ached at his words. She had known something was off, but hearing him admit it, seeing the weight of his pain, hit her harder than she expected. "I've been trying to push through it, but it's like everything is piling up, and I'm losing control," Luke continued, his voice cracking slightly. "I'm stuck, and I don't know how to get out of it. It's like I can't breathe." Margaret felt a lump form in her throat. She knelt beside him, her hand still on his shoulder. "Look, you don't have to go through this alone. You never have to carry everything by yourself." He shook his head, looking down again. "I don't want to keep letting you down. I see how hard you work, and I don't want to be the thing holding you back. I thought I could figure it out, but now I feel like I'm not enough." Margaret's heart broke. She had never wanted him to feel that way, had never wanted him to think that his struggles were a burden on her. She reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. "You're not a burden. You never have been. You are enough, Luke. You are more than enough." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "I know you've been carrying a lot, and I want you to know it's okay to lean on me. It's okay to ask for help." Luke looked at her then, his eyes searching hers as though trying to find something to hold on to. For a moment, the weight in his eyes lightened, just a little. But there was still a wall between them, a fear he hadn't fully voiced yet. I don't know how to be the person you want me to be, he admitted quietly, the words laced with a deep sense of guilt. You've always been so strong, so together. And I feel like I can't measure up. Margaret's chest tightened, but she forced herself to stay calm. She cupped his face gently in her hands, guiding him to look at her. Luke, you don't need to measure up to anyone. Not me, not anyone. You are your own person, and I love you for exactly who you are. You don't have to pretend to be perfect. He stared at her for a long moment, as if her words were sinking in slowly. Then, with a deep breath, he finally let out a shaky laugh. You always know just what to say. Margaret smiled softly, brushing a stray lock of hair from his forehead. I wish I had the answers, but I'll always be here to listen. Whenever you need to talk, or just need someone to sit with you, I'm here. Luke nodded, the tears that had threatened to spill earlier now fading into the background. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, his gaze dropping to the table once more. I've been scared, Mom, he admitted in a quiet voice. Scared that I'm not good enough for anything, that I'm not enough for you or for myself. Margaret's heart went out to him, the vulnerability in his voice cutting through her like a knife. She squeezed his hand tighter. Luke, you don't have to be good enough for anyone but yourself. And I'm proud of you, proud of how far you've come. He looked up at her, his eyes softer now, as though he was seeing her for the first time in a long while. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was a glimmer of hope in his gaze. I don't know what's next, he said slowly, but I think I can start figuring it out. Maybe I need to stop running from it. Margaret nodded, feeling the weight in her chest finally start to lift. That's all any of us can do. Take it one step at a time. They sat there together for a while, the quiet between them now a comfort rather than a burden. Margaret knew that Luke still had a long road ahead of him, but for the first time in ages, she truly believed that he could find his way. As the rain began to fall outside, soft and steady, Margaret felt a warmth in her heart. Sometimes, it was in the darkest moments, when the storm seemed the fiercest, that the true strength of family was revealed. And in that moment, she knew that they would weather this storm together. The days after their conversation were filled with a quiet sense of healing. Margaret noticed small changes in Luke, slight shifts in his posture, the way he interacted with the world. He wasn't completely healed, not by a long shot, but there was a renewed sense of hope in him that hadn't been there before. And for Margaret, that was a victory in itself. It wasn't easy for either of them. The fear of failure still lingered in Luke's eyes, and Margaret knew it would take time for him to truly believe in himself again. But she was determined to be there for him, to help him rebuild, even if that meant taking one day at a time. That Saturday, after a long week of work, Margaret decided to do something a little different. She had been so focused on the demands of her job and her responsibilities at home that she hadn't made time for herself or for Luke. It was time to change that. How about we take a trip to the lake today? Margaret asked as she sat across from Luke at the kitchen table. He looked up from his phone, where he had been absent-mindedly scrolling through messages, and raised an eyebrow. The lake? He repeated, clearly surprised. Yeah, she said with a smile. I think we both could use a break. A little time away from the house, the work, just some fresh air. What do you say? Luke hesitated for a moment, clearly weighing the idea, but then he nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. That sounds nice. Actually, I could use a change of scenery. Margaret's heart warmed at the sight of his willingness to engage, to step outside his own doubts for a moment. She stood up, moving to the closet to grab a jacket. I'll pack a picnic. You grab the keys. As they made their way to the car, the tension that had been hanging in the air seemed to lift, replaced by something lighter, something that had been missing for far too long. The drive to the lake was quiet, but there was an unspoken understanding between them. Margaret knew that Luke was still working through a lot, but today wasn't about fixing everything. It was about being together. When they arrived, the lake was serene, the water still and reflective, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. It was the kind of place where time seemed to slow down, where the world felt like it could be put on pause for just a while. Margaret spread out a blanket under a tree, and they settled down together, the basket of food between them. Luke took a deep breath, inhaling the fresh, earthy air, and for the first time in weeks, Margaret saw a real smile cross his face. "This is nice," he said, reaching for a sandwich. "I didn't realize how much I needed this." Margaret smiled back, feeling a peace settle over her. Sometimes we all need a little time to just breathe. They ate in silence for a while, the only sounds being the rustling of the leaves and the occasional chirp of birds in the distance. As the afternoon wore on, the sky shifted, the sun beginning its slow descent toward the horizon. The warm golden light bathed the lake, turning the water into a shimmering mirror. Luke glanced at her, his eyes thoughtful. "Mom, I've been thinking a lot about what you said the other day, about not needing to be perfect." Margaret turned to face him, her heart swelling with pride. "I meant every word of it, Luke." He nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the lake. "I think I've been so afraid of failing that I never even tried. I've been so worried about being enough for you, for the world, that I forgot to just be me." Margaret felt a lump in her throat, her eyes stinging with emotion. "You are enough, Luke. You always have been." There was a long pause as they both sat there, taking in the beauty of the moment. The sky above was painted with the soft hues of sunset, and for the first time in a long time, Margaret felt a deep sense of peace. She knew that Luke's journey wasn't over, and there would be days ahead when the darkness would creep back in. But in that moment, surrounded by the calm of nature, she felt like everything would be okay. "I want to do better, Mom," Luke said, his voice filled with determination. "I want to find my own path. I don't know what that looks like yet, but I'm ready to try." Margaret reached over and placed her hand on his. "That's all I can ask for. Just keep moving forward, no matter how small the steps." Luke squeezed her hand, his expression one of quiet resolve. For the first time in a long time, he seemed certain that he could move forward. And for Margaret, that was enough. As the evening drew to a close and they packed up to head home, Margaret couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But with Luke's willingness to change and her commitment to standing by him, they had a chance at something better, a future where they both could thrive, where their bond would only grow stronger. Driving back in the car, the night air cool and crisp, Margaret glanced over at Luke, his face illuminated by the soft glow of the dashboard light. He was looking out the window, lost in thought, but there was a quiet confidence in his posture, in the way he held himself. For the first time in months, Margaret felt hopeful about the future. Together, they could face anything. The days following their trip to the lake were filled with a sense of cautious optimism. Luke seemed lighter somehow, as if the weight of his doubts had been lifted, if only for a little while. But Margaret knew the healing process was rarely linear. She had seen how easily the tides could change, how quickly the old patterns of self-doubt and insecurity could come crashing back. It was one of those mornings when the familiar sense of tension seemed to return. Margaret woke up early, the sun still hidden behind the horizon, casting the world in a soft, sleepy light. She made her way to the kitchen, as she often did, to start the coffee brewing. The quiet hum of the machine was a comforting sound, a routine she cherished. But this morning, it wasn't enough to keep her mind from wandering. Luke had been quiet the night before, withdrawn even, and Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that something was weighing on him. She tried to dismiss it at first, telling herself that he just needed space, but she knew him too well. His silence wasn't just a sign of restlessness, it was a sign of something deeper. She was mid-thought when Luke shuffled into the kitchen, his hair slightly disheveled and his eyes heavy with fatigue. He didn't say anything at first, but there was an air about him, something tense, something off. Margaret set the coffee cup down with a soft clink, her eyes narrowing with concern. "You okay, Luke?" she asked gently, her voice warm with concern. "You don't seem like yourself this morning." Luke hesitated, his fingers drumming lightly on the edge of the counter. He seemed unsure of how to begin, his usual confidence replaced with a quiet vulnerability. Finally, after a long pause, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not sure where to go from here, Mom," he confessed, his eyes focused on the counter in front of him. "I feel like I'm stuck again, like I'm moving forward, but I keep hitting these walls I don't know how to break through." Margaret's heart ached for him. She could see the frustration in his eyes, the longing for something more, something bigger than the small, frustrating life he felt trapped in. She walked over to him and placed a hand on his shoulder, offering what comfort she could in the moment. "It's okay to feel lost, Luke," she said, her voice steady but soft. "You've come so far already, and there's no shame in feeling uncertain. Change takes time. It's not going to happen overnight." Luke didn't look up, but he gave a small nod, the weight of his thoughts clearly still pressing on him. I don't know if I'm strong enough to keep going. I keep thinking about everything I've failed at, and it's like those thoughts keep taking over." Margaret's mind raced, her heart heavy with the understanding of what he was going through. She knew that feeling well, the way failure seemed to haunt every decision, every misstep, until it was impossible to believe in yourself again. But she also knew something he hadn't quite grasped yet. Failure wasn't the end. It wasn't even the beginning of the end. It was just a part of the journey. "You are strong enough, Luke," she said, her voice firm with the kind of certainty that came from a lifetime of experience. "The fact that you're here, that you're still trying, that's proof of your strength. You don't need to be perfect. You don't need to have it all figured out. All you need to do is keep going." Luke looked up at her then, his eyes filled with uncertainty. "But what if I fail again? What if I'm not enough?" Margaret gently cupped his face in her hands, her gaze unwavering. "You are more than enough, Luke. And if you stumble, you pick yourself up and keep going. That's what matters. It's not about never falling. It's about how you rise every time." There was a long silence between them, one that stretched out, filled with the weight of their shared history and unspoken understanding. Luke looked down at the ground, the battle in his mind still raging. But Margaret could see the cracks beginning to form in his armor, the faintest flicker of hope breaking through the walls he had built around himself. "I don't know if I'm ready," he muttered, his voice low, almost like he was speaking to himself more than to her. "But I don't want to keep feeling this way." Margaret squeezed his shoulders gently. "You don't have to be ready. You just have to take the first step, Luke. That's all. The rest will come as you go." He didn't say anything more, but Margaret could sense the shift, a small but significant change. There was still fear in his eyes, still uncertainty in his posture, but there was also something else, a glimmer of possibility, a tiny spark of courage that hadn't been there before. Later that day, after a quiet morning spent sorting through his thoughts, Luke took a small step toward the future. He decided to take up a hobby he had put off for years, painting. It wasn't a career path, and it didn't promise anything in terms of success. But it was something he loved, something that gave him peace, a way to express himself without the burden of expectation. Margaret watched him set up his small easel in the corner of the living room, his movements slow but deliberate. He was tentative at first, unsure of himself, but as the brush met the canvas, she saw him relax just a little. The weight of the world didn't lift entirely, but it seemed lighter, just for a moment. It was a step, Margaret realized, and it was enough. She knew that patience would be the key. There would be days when Luke faltered, days when doubt crept in like a shadow, but she also knew that with time, and with love, he would continue to move forward. And so would she. Luke stood before the canvas, his eyes tracing the paintbrush as it moved across the surface, unsure of where it was going. There was something comforting about it, the way the colors blended together, swirling into something that was his, something nobody could take away. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to forget about the pressure, the expectations of success, the doubts about his future. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about the process, the act of creating something that spoke to him. He glanced over at his mother, who sat on the couch nearby, reading a book. Her presence, quiet yet constant, was a source of strength he hadn't fully appreciated until recently. Luke had always been stubborn, determined to prove himself on his own terms. But there was something about her unwavering belief in him that made him want to try to be better, not just for himself but for her as well. "Mom," he called out, his voice tentative, "do you think I'm making a mistake?" Margaret lowered her book, setting it aside. She had noticed the hesitance in his voice, the subtle crack in his confidence. The question was more than just about the painting. It was a reflection of the uncertainty that still lingered in his mind. the same uncertainty that had haunted him for years. A mistake, she repeated, her tone thoughtful. I think you're figuring it out, Luke. That's not a mistake. That's life. Luke turned away from the canvas, his eyes meeting hers. He wanted to say more, wanted to explain how everything still felt so out of reach, so distant, but he couldn't find the words. Instead, he just nodded, trying to let the moment sink in. He could feel the tension in his shoulders easing, just a bit. Margaret was right. It wasn't about having all the answers. It was about trying, about allowing himself to fail and then get back up. You're doing great, Margaret said, offering him a warm smile. One step at a time, right? Luke managed a small smile in return. Yeah, one step at a time. The rest of the afternoon passed in a quiet rhythm. Margaret worked on her knitting, and Luke continued painting, slowly filling the canvas with colors and shapes that only he understood. It was an act of freedom, of expression without fear of judgment. Each stroke brought him a little closer to the person he wanted to be. The next few weeks were filled with small victories and moments of growth. Luke spent more time painting, his canvases beginning to fill with abstract landscapes that captured his emotions. Bright bursts of color, dark shadows, and swirls of paint that told the story of his struggle and his progress. It wasn't a polished masterpiece, but it was his. That was enough. Margaret watched him from the sidelines, offering encouragement when needed, but giving him the space to explore this new part of himself. She knew that, like her, he would find his way through the process of creation and self-discovery. And perhaps in the end, it wasn't just about the painting. It was about the peace he was beginning to find within himself. One evening, as they sat down for dinner, Luke looked up from his plate, his eyes filled with a new sense of determination. "Mom," he said, breaking the silence, "I've been thinking about something." Margaret set her fork down, giving him her full attention. She had learned to listen closely when he had something important to say. "I want to take this painting thing seriously," Luke continued. "I'm not saying I want to make a career out of it or anything, but I want to show my work to others. Maybe even sell some pieces. I want to see where it could go." Margaret's heart swelled with pride. She had known that the spark would come eventually, that moment when he would look at something he created and realize that it mattered, not just to him, but to the world. He was still uncertain about many things, but there was something about this decision that felt different. It felt like a step forward. "That's wonderful, Luke," Margaret said, her voice full of warmth. "You've worked hard for this. I know you've got it in you." Luke's face softened, his eyes flickering with a mix of gratitude and uncertainty. "I'm scared," he admitted, his voice low. "What if it doesn't work out? What if no one likes it?" Margaret smiled gently, reaching across the table to take his hand. "It doesn't matter if everyone likes it, Luke. What matters is that you're doing something you love. And if it doesn't work out the way you hope, that's okay. The journey is just as important as the destination." Luke looked at her, his expression thoughtful. For the first time in a long while, he felt the weight of his fears begin to loosen, just a little. Maybe Margaret was right. Maybe it didn't have to be perfect. He didn't have to have all the answers. He just needed to keep moving forward. The next morning, Luke spent hours in the local art gallery, talking to the owner about the possibility of displaying his work. His nerves were on edge, his stomach churning with the familiar fear of rejection. But he pushed through it, taking one step at a time. It wasn't easy, and there were moments of doubt, but as the weeks went by, he began to see small signs of success. His paintings were displayed at a local exhibition, and a few sold to people who admired his unique style. Margaret couldn't have been more proud. She had always known that Luke had the talent, the drive, and the heart to succeed. But seeing him take this chance, seeing him push past his fears, was something she would never forget. But even with these triumphs, Margaret knew that the real test lay ahead. As Luke's art gained attention, the world outside their small home would continue to challenge him in ways he hadn't yet anticipated. Could he navigate the pressures of success, the expectations of others? Would he remain true to himself, to the lessons he had learned along the way? As she watched him paint late into the night, she wondered what challenges lay ahead for her son. And she knew, deep in her heart, that no matter what, they would face it together. The day the first painting sold was a moment Luke would never forget. He had stood there, staring at the small price tag attached to the corner of his canvas, as the art gallery owner smiled at him. "Someone is interested in your work," she had said, her voice tinged with excitement. "I think it's going to sell." Luke had tried to hide his disbelief, but it was impossible. The thought that someone actually wanted to buy something he created, something that had once seemed like a mere escape from the pain of his past, was surreal. For a moment, he felt like a fraud, as if he hadn't earned this moment. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized it wasn't about the price or the recognition. It was about validation, a quiet confirmation that his journey had meaning, that his struggles, his failures, had led him to this very moment. When the transaction was complete, the buyer turned and gave him a polite nod. Luke watched, his heart pounding, as the painting was carefully wrapped in plastic, ready to go to its new home. He was left standing there, a mix of exhilaration and uncertainty swirling inside him. As he left the gallery, the cool breeze brushing against his face, Luke felt the weight of the world lift from his shoulders, if only for a moment. It wasn't just about the sale. It was the realization that he was moving forward, that he had the courage to take a risk and see it through. Later that evening, Margaret sat across from Luke at the dinner table, the smell of her famous stew filling the room. She had been waiting for this moment, for him to share the news of his success. When Luke walked in with a broad smile on his face, she knew immediately. "You did it, didn't you?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with excitement. Luke nodded, setting the keys to the car on the table. "I did. It's sold. Someone actually bought one of my paintings." Margaret's face lit up with pride. "Oh, Luke, that's amazing. I knew you could do it. You've worked so hard for this." Luke sank into his chair, his eyes still wide from the shock of it all. "I can't believe it. I mean, I always hoped, but to actually have someone believe in my work." His voice trailed off as he processed the weight of the moment. "You're more than just talented, Luke. You've got heart. You've got a story to tell, and people see that. That's what makes your art special." He looked at his mother, her unwavering support a constant source of comfort. "I don't know what's next, though. This is just the beginning, right? What if it's a fluke?" Margaret smiled warmly. "Don't think that way. It's the beginning of something real. You've already proven to yourself that you can do this. It's about building on that, taking it one step at a time." Luke felt a knot in his chest loosen. Her words were always the grounding force he needed. They didn't have the answers to everything, but they had each other. And that, he realized, was enough. The next few weeks passed in a blur of excitement. Luke's paintings began to gain attention from a wider audience. The local art community took note, and the gallery owner, impressed by the positive response, began pushing him to create more. He worked tirelessly, finding himself immersed in the process, each brushstroke feeling more deliberate, more intentional than the last. It was as though the act of creating had become a lifeline, a way for him to communicate his innermost thoughts and emotions. But success brought its own challenges. The more attention his work received, the more people began to ask about his past. The questions weren't malicious, but the curiosity was unrelenting. Where had he learned to paint? What inspired his unique style? People were fascinated by his journey, by the fact that someone who had come from such a difficult background could now be recognized for his talent. At first, Luke enjoyed the attention. It felt good to be seen, to have his work acknowledged. But as the weeks went on, the weight of the questions began to feel oppressive. He wasn't just a painter anymore. He was a story, an inspiration. He felt as though his identity had shifted, and he wasn't sure if it was in a way that he liked. One evening, after a particularly long day at the gallery, Luke sat in his studio, staring at his latest piece. The colors seemed to blur together as his thoughts swirled around in his head. He couldn't shake the feeling that his success was tied to the idea of overcoming adversity, of being the inspiring figure people wanted him to be. It was exhausting, and it made him question the authenticity of his journey. Margaret came into the studio, her soft footsteps barely making a sound on the wooden floor. She knew something was off. "What's going on, Luke?" she asked, her voice calm but concerned. Luke didn't immediately respond. Instead, he walked over to the canvas, his fingers lightly brushing the surface of the paint. I feel like people see me as this success story. The guy who made it out of the rough neighborhood, who turned his life around. But I don't know if they really see me. They see what they want to see. I'm tired of it. Margaret stepped closer, her presence steady. Luke, I get it. I know it's a lot of pressure, but you can't control how others see you. You can only control how you see yourself. And I see you. Your struggles, your triumphs, your art. That's who you are. Not the story they're telling about you. He let her words sink in, the truth of them both comforting and challenging. Margaret had always seen him for who he truly was, not for the narrative the world had created around him. And maybe, just maybe, it was time for him to reclaim that sense of self. As the days passed, Luke began to take control of his narrative. He no longer tried to fit into the mold others had created for him. Instead, he embraced his imperfections, his doubts, and his struggles. He allowed his art to speak for itself, without needing to explain every detail or justify every stroke. His paintings became more personal, more raw, and more honest than they had ever been before. And through it all, Margaret remained by his side, offering quiet support, reminding him of the strength he carried within. It wasn't about fame or recognition or the pressure of being a symbol. It was about being true to himself and letting the world see him for who he truly was. Luke sat in the middle of his studio, staring at the blank canvas before him. The silence was overwhelming, but it wasn't the calm kind of silence that inspired him. It was the kind of silence that made him question everything he had built. For the first time in weeks, the excitement of his newfound success felt like a burden rather than a blessing. His latest piece, a large, vibrant portrait of a woman gazing at a field of wildflowers, had not gone over as well as he had hoped. It was a departure from his usual work, more abstract, more raw. He had wanted to push boundaries, to express something deep within himself. But when the gallery owner had seen it, her face had fallen. "I don't know if this fits with the direction we're going," she had said, her voice tight. "It's different, Luke. I know you're experimenting, but it's risky. People might not get it." Luke had tried to argue, to defend the piece, but the weight of her words had stuck with him. He wasn't sure if it was the fear of failure or the overwhelming pressure of living up to the expectations he had set for himself, but he suddenly felt like an imposter. He wasn't sure if his passion for art still came from a place of genuine expression, or if it had simply become a commodity. He rubbed his face with both hands, frustration building. Why had he let himself be pulled into this whirlwind of success? He had wanted to share his story, to paint for himself and no one else. But now, he couldn't remember the last time he had painted without worrying about how others would perceive it. Margaret walked into the studio, sensing the tension in the air. She had been watching Luke struggle with this for days. His passion was fading, and she knew it wasn't because of a lack of talent or drive. It was because he had lost sight of why he started painting in the first place. "You okay, Luke?" she asked, standing in the doorway. Luke didn't look up at first. I don't know anymore, Mom. Everything feels so off. I'm starting to wonder if I'm doing this for the right reasons. If this whole thing is even real." Margaret's expression softened. She walked over to him, sitting down on the stool beside him. "What happened?" "It's this piece," Luke replied, finally looking up at her. "I thought it was something different, something fresh. But when she saw it, the gallery owner, she didn't like it. She said it wasn't what people were looking for. And now, I'm questioning everything. Was it even any good?" Margaret studied his face, her eyes full of understanding. "Luke, you can't paint for them. You can't let other people decide what your art is worth. Art isn't about fitting into someone else's box. It's about expressing yourself, whether people understand it or not. You've always told me how you paint to make sense of things inside yourself. Don't lose that." Luke was silent for a moment, her words settling in the space between them. It wasn't just about the gallery or the praise. It was about staying true to the journey, even when it wasn't easy. "You're right," he said finally, his voice quiet but resolute. "I started painting for myself, not for anyone else. Maybe I've been chasing something that isn't me." Margaret smiled. "It's okay to question your path, Luke, but remember why you started. Stay true to yourself. And when you do, the people who matter will see that." The next day, Luke returned to his studio with a new sense of purpose. He didn't want to create paintings that fit into any predetermined mold. He wanted to paint for himself, raw, unfiltered, without thinking about the market or the critics. His brush moved across the canvas with more freedom than it had in weeks. He began to layer colors in ways he hadn't before, mixing shades of red, blue, and yellow in a chaotic swirl that felt like a reflection of his inner turmoil. As the hours passed, he felt something shift inside him. The pressure began to melt away, and he allowed himself to embrace the messiness of the process. He wasn't trying to prove anything anymore. He was simply creating. Margaret watched from the doorway, a soft smile on her face. She had always known that Luke needed space to figure things out on his own. He had come so far, and now, he was on the verge of finding his own truth again. 2 days later, Luke received a phone call from the gallery owner. His heart raced as he picked up the phone, not sure what to expect. "Look, I just wanted to say, I was thinking about that piece you brought in the other day," she began. "I think I was too quick to judge it. I saw something in it that I missed the first time. The depth, the emotion. It's unlike anything I've seen from you before. I'd like to put it in the next show. What do you think?" Luke's breath caught in his throat. The words he had longed to hear were finally coming, but it didn't feel like the validation he had been chasing. This time, it felt different. He felt like he was standing on solid ground, no longer swayed by external opinions. "I think it's a great idea," he replied, his voice steady. "I'd love to have it in the show." After they hung up, Luke sat back in his chair, staring at the unfinished canvas in front of him. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, he felt at peace. He was painting for himself again, without expectations, without fear. And that, he realized, was more than enough. The next morning, Luke woke up with an unfamiliar sense of clarity. The weight that had settled in his chest over the past few weeks seemed to lift, and for the first time in a long while, he was eager to begin his day. The phone call from the gallery owner had left him in a state of quiet reflection. He had done it. He had reclaimed his authenticity. Margaret had always been his rock, the one who understood him better than anyone else. But it was only now that he truly appreciated the wisdom she had shared with him. Art wasn't about the validation of others. It was about the expression of his inner truth. No one could take that away from him. As he sipped his coffee, Luke glanced around the studio. The canvases that lined the walls, each a piece of his journey, now seemed less like reminders of pressure and doubt and more like personal milestones. They told the story of who he had been and who he was becoming. He was no longer searching for external approval. He was finding his voice. Later that afternoon, Luke made his way to the local art supply store. He walked through the aisles, grabbing paints and brushes with a renewed sense of purpose. As he turned the corner toward the canvas section, he spotted an elderly woman perusing the same shelf. She was bent over slightly, her face wrinkled with age, but there was something about her presence that immediately struck him. She wore a bright red scarf that contrasted with the pale gray of her coat, and her eyes, though tired, seemed to sparkle with a quiet wisdom. Her hands moved slowly but deliberately as she picked up a roll of canvas. Without thinking, Luke walked up to her. "Excuse me," he said, his voice warm but unsure. "I couldn't help but notice your scarf. It's beautiful." The woman looked up at him, surprised by the compliment. She smiled softly, a spark of recognition flickering in her eyes. "Thank you," she replied, her voice gentle but firm. "It was my mother's. She was a painter too, once upon a time." Luke's interest piqued. "A painter? That's amazing. What kind of art did she make?" "She painted portraits mostly," the woman said, her gaze drifting to the shelves of canvases in front of her. "She had a unique way of capturing the soul of a person, really, but she didn't do it for fame or fortune. She painted for herself, to understand the world around her, to capture moments in time." Luke couldn't help but smile. Sounds like she knew exactly what she was doing. Art for the soul, not for anyone else. The woman's eyes brightened, as if Luke had spoken her unspoken truth. "Exactly. That's the way it should be. When you paint for yourself, there's no pressure. It's just you and the canvas, creating something that speaks to you." Luke felt a surge of gratitude. He had heard these words before, from his mother, from his own heart, but hearing them from someone else, a stranger, in this moment, felt like an affirmation of everything he had been rediscovering. "I couldn't agree more," Luke said, his voice steady. "It's easy to get lost in the idea of what others want from you, but in the end, it's the work that stays true to yourself that really matters." The woman nodded, her eyes gleaming. "I can see you've learned that. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." They exchanged a few more words, and Luke left the store with his art supplies in hand, but with something more valuable in his heart, the knowledge that he was on the right path. His work had always been about finding meaning, and he wasn't going to let anyone, no matter how much success he found, take that away from him. Back at the studio, Luke spent the next few days immersed in his new work. He was painting with a freedom he hadn't felt in ages, layering colors and shapes in ways that felt both new and familiar. Each brushstroke seemed to carry a deeper meaning, a reflection of his own growth. Margaret stopped by one afternoon, as she often did, to check in on him. She watched in silence as he worked, a contented smile crossing her face. She could see the difference in him, the shift from doubt to confidence, from striving for approval to creating for himself. "How's it going, Luke?" she asked, her voice full of pride. Luke glanced up from the canvas, his eyes bright. "It's going well, Mom. Really well. I think I'm finally getting back to what I've always wanted to do." Margaret nodded, sensing the change in his energy. "I'm glad to hear that. You've always had a gift, Luke. But the true magic happens when you stop trying to prove something and just let yourself create." Luke's smile widened, his heart swelling with gratitude. "Thanks for always believing in me, Mom. I don't think I could have done this without you." Margaret chuckled softly. "You didn't need me to do it. You just needed to believe in yourself." As the weeks passed, Luke's art began to take on a life of its own. His paintings evolved, growing bolder and more expressive. The gallery owner who had initially hesitated to show his work now became one of his biggest supporters. But even as his name gained recognition, Luke remained grounded in his original intent. He wasn't painting for fame or fortune. He was painting for himself, and in doing so, he had found his true voice as an artist. One evening, as Luke sat in the studio reflecting on his journey, he realized something profound. He wasn't the same person he had been when he started this path. He had grown, evolved, and found a sense of peace that he had longed for. His art had become a mirror of his soul, capturing not just the world around him but the depths of his own transformation. Luke stood in front of the canvas, his heart racing. It was almost finished. He had poured everything into this final piece, every lesson, every moment of doubt, every conversation, and every memory. The strokes of his brush were not just paint on fabric. They were emotions, experiences, and dreams woven together into a story only he could tell. Margaret had visited earlier, offering her usual encouragement, but today, Luke wasn't just creating art for the sake of art. He was completing a journey, a personal odyssey that had begun the day he chose to follow his heart, regardless of the noise from the world around him. This piece, the one he had worked on for weeks, was unlike anything he had ever painted. It was more than just color and composition. It was an expression of his truth, his identity, and his bond with Margaret. In a way, it was a tribute to everything that had shaped him, his roots, his struggles, and his eventual liberation from the pressures of fame and expectation. As Luke stepped back, he studied the canvas with a sense of awe. The swirls of color felt alive, almost as if they were moving on their own. There was a fluidity to it, a dynamic energy that mirrored the tumultuous emotions he had worked through. The piece was not perfect, but it was undeniably his. It was then that he heard the door creak open behind him. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. "Mom," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. Margaret's footsteps echoed in the quiet studio. She had been a constant presence throughout his journey, but today she seemed to linger in the space between them with a sense of understanding. She didn't say anything at first, merely standing beside him, her gaze fixed on the painting. "What do you think?" Luke asked, a hint of vulnerability in his voice. Margaret took a slow breath, her eyes scanning every inch of the canvas. She stepped closer, her hand reaching out, fingers lightly brushing the surface as though feeling the pulse of the work. For a long moment, she didn't speak, and Luke found himself holding his breath. Finally, she looked at him, her eyes soft with pride. "It's beautiful, Luke. It's you. Every stroke, every color. It's all you." Luke felt a lump form in his throat. His mother had always known him better than anyone else. Her words were more than just praise. They were an acknowledgement of his growth, his journey, and the person he had become. He had been afraid for so long, afraid of failing, of disappointing others, of losing himself in the pursuit of success. But now, standing here in front of the painting, he realized that he had already won. Not in the way the world measured success, but in the way that truly mattered. He had found peace within himself. As the evening wore on, Luke and Margaret sat together, discussing the painting, their lives, and everything in between. There was no rush, no expectations. They were simply sharing a moment of connection, a moment that felt timeless. The next day, the gallery owner arrived, as promised. Luke wasn't nervous anymore. He didn't need the validation. He had already found it within himself. He had discovered that the true value of his work wasn't in the applause it received, but in the way it resonated with his soul. The gallery owner stepped into the studio, his eyes immediately drawn to the painting. He paused, taking in the vibrant colors, the depth, the emotion. Luke could see the admiration in the man's eyes, but he didn't wait for the approval. He simply stood there, watching. After a long silence, the gallery owner finally spoke. "Luke, this is extraordinary. I've never seen anything like it. This is the kind of work that changes people, the kind that lasts." Luke smiled, his heart full. "Thank you. But this isn't about changing anyone. It's just about being true to myself." The gallery owner nodded, his expression one of respect. "Well, that's what makes it so special. It's genuine. It's real." In the weeks that followed, the painting was displayed in the gallery, and Luke's name began to spread in the art world. His work caught the attention of critics and collectors, but none of it seemed to matter as much as it once had. He was no longer chasing approval. His success, however it came, was no longer a measure of his worth. Luke had finally learned the most important lesson. Art, like life, was a reflection of the self, and as long as he stayed true to who he was, he would always find meaning in his work, whether it was admired by many or seen by just a few. On a quiet evening, as Luke and Margaret sat together in the studio, looking over his latest pieces, Margaret turned to him with a soft smile. "You've come a long way, Luke," she said. "I'm proud of you." Luke smiled back, his eyes glistening with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you, Mom. You taught me that it's not about the destination, it's about the journey, and I'm finally at peace with mine." Margaret reached out and squeezed his hand. "And that's all that matters. The rest will follow." As they sat there, in the quiet of the studio, surrounded by the fruits of his labor, Luke knew that this was just the beginning. His journey was far from over, but for the first time, he was walking it with a sense of fulfillment that came from within, and nothing at all, could take that away.